Great. So then, please warmly welcome our next speaker, which is James, sorry, and he will tell us about practical attack simulations in CAI. And yeah, I guess he will tell us what it has to do with this very nice and exciting picture. Welcome.
Hi everyone, thank you. Can you give me a little wave at the back if you can hear me okay? Yeah? Excellent. One guy waved. Brilliant. So yeah, hi everyone, thank you for coming. So this talk is going to be about sharing how we've been able to do practical attack simulations for our critical national infrastructure clients. It's going to be quite a short talk. This was meant to be a lightning talk. But really there's three things that I want you to take away with you today. So the first is a high-level view of what a typical CNI environment looks like. So this is based on my understanding, and we're talking explicitly here about the environments that have quite a lot of operational technology in them, or industrial control systems. So your experience with CNI clients may be slightly different to mine. The second is a set of principles that you can take away with you and hopefully apply to your own engagements to reduce some of the testing risk traditionally associated with doing these types of activities. And the third is a glimpse at some of the common attack paths that we often find doing these types of engagements, so that when you're in the same situation, you can know what to look out for. So my name's James Coote. I'm a consultant with MWR in the UK. My focus is primarily on running the kind of white box attack simulations that I'm going to talk to you about today. And I've done a few of these for MWR's CNI clients in the past as well. One of the first questions we often get asked is, like, why bother doing attack simulations? You know, clients will come to us and say, oh yeah, we're ISO 27001 compliant, you know, we do X, Y, and Z audits, you know, everything's great. I think most of us in the room recognize that that isn't actually enough. So you just have to look at some of the news articles recently and look at the sophistication of the threat actors that are actually working against our clients right now. And you quickly realize that as security professionals, we need to be simulating these threats to give our clients a realistic sense of their exposure to risk. And I feel like that's where these practical attack simulations come into play. When I talk about OT or ICS or you know, these types of things, people think of this and then they get very quickly scared. This obviously plays a huge part in it, and I'm not discounting that. One of the arguments I would like to make, though, is that the crossover between the traditional enterprise organizations that we're probably most familiar working with and the CNI-specific environments is probably far greater than you may first anticipate. And so some of the attack paths that we're most familiar with, we will find in these kind of environments as well. And we'll cover that in a bit more detail when I start talking about the specific attack paths. So one of the keys to understanding the assets that an attacker's looking to compromise is to look at what they're trying to achieve. So for the most part, an attacker's objective will fall into one of three categories. So it's either destructive, you know, blowing something up, disruptive, such as stopping the flow of a resource or affecting visibility of something, or be information theft, such as stealing the company's intellectual property. So I think destructive is quite unique, just in the fact that it's incredibly difficult to achieve. So the level of environment-specific knowledge that an attacker would have to have in order to subvert a physical process, and the physical controls that they would need to bypass on those devices to actually have an effect, and the speed that they'd need to do all of that at before being detected, means that this is probably out of reach for all but the most sophisticated attackers. But it's probably the disruptive and the information theft risks that we'll be looking to simulate during our assessments. Sorry, actually, one point I want to make on this as well is you could argue, however, that the attack positioning phase, so where they're trying to escalate their privileges, etc., is very similar for all three of those. So it doesn't actually necessarily matter what the attacker objective is. The activities they'll be performing are likely to be very similar. And we'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a minute. So I'm conscious a lot of people in the room won't necessarily be familiar with what an ICS environment typically looks like. So let me just spend a minute or two giving my take on what a typical environment looks like. And this, again, is based on my experience. I'm sure others will be far more familiar than I am, and will have different takes on what these look like. So the purpose, basically, take a step back. More often than not, these clients will have these things like fill stations. And the purpose of these fill stations is to manipulate the physical processes. So, for example, there may be a sensor in a water tank. And if the water dips below a certain level, a valve might open and the pump might turn on, for example. And it's ultimately these components that an attacker with a destructive or disruptive objective is looking to manipulate. These field sites will then typically be linked to a head office somewhere, so via satellite, ISDN, for example. And within the HQ, or the process control environment, I like to consider the assets falling into one of three categories. So typically, the control room is where all the magic happens. So these are where your operators are sitting, typically working in a shift pattern, monitoring their OT-specific applications and checking everything's running correctly, and taking any corrective measures that they need to. These OT-specific applications will then be interfacing with things such as the SCADA process servers and the OPC servers. And these are the things that are speaking directly to those physical processes that an attacker is trying to manipulate. And then most of the rest of the stuff can largely be classified as supporting infrastructure. So in my experience, is often Windows-based. So you'll have things like a domain controller, SCCM server in there. We see Citrix being used quite a lot within the control room to virtualize with something like XenApp these OT-specific applications. We might see information sharing portals like SharePoint. There'll be analytics and forecasting software to allow those operators in the control room to make some kind of decision. And then there'll be file shares where they're backing up data or sharing information with each other. Adjacent to the process control environment, then, you have what we're most familiar with, the traditional corporate network. So again, almost always Windows-based. So you'll have your domain controllers and file servers again. And this is where your corporate employees or your third-party suppliers would typically sit. And a number of these components in the corporate network need legitimate access to the process control environment just to do their job. So we often see Citrix again being used as some kind of portal for corporate users to access process control assets. And we'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a second. We see jump boxes being used for IT administrators. So this is particularly pertinent when your IT administrators sit in the corporate domain day to day. And then the business planning applications that will sometimes be pulling data in from that process control environment. And that will allow these business owners to make key decisions like when they need to buy equipment and this type of thing. So now that we've got an understanding of what these environments typically look like, I'd like to share with you 5 rules or guidelines that we've successfully applied in the past to our engagements that we feel go a long way to reducing the traditional risks associated with these attack simulations. And they are a bit tongue-in-cheek, I'll warn you. So the first one is to model your threat actors as accurately as possible. So part of this is knowing what threat actor you're trying to simulate. So for the most part, this will be the most advanced actor that you're capable of simulating. So you want to be looking at state-sponsored actors. And this involves using all the tools and techniques at your disposal to accurately, or as best as possible, simulate these actors. And part of this is knowing what they wouldn't do. So if you're going on site and running Nmap and Nessus against the entire OT estate, something's probably gone quite wrong. So you just need to be conscious about what they would and wouldn't do, just as importantly. The second is to make sure, or as far as possible, all facets of your engagements are run in a white box and collaborative way. So you should be, wherever possible, striving to conduct interviews with your clients' business and technical stakeholders. So this will allow you to rapidly understand their OT-specific estate and also any environment-specific quirks that they may have. And this is especially important because you get to speak to the guys and women who do this day to day, and you might identify some of the perhaps more esoteric attack paths that if you were running this in a traditional covert red team way, you just wouldn't find. And this gives a lot more value for the client. In my experience as well, this is perhaps a very important point, is that people will be really nervous about your testing. So by being able to speak to these people face to face, you get to control the narrative. So you can alleviate their fears and give them some understanding, some insight into what you're actually doing. And this is just going to serve to build up that client relationship, probably going to lead to future work as well. But it's just going to open these doors and get you that information that you need to be successful. The third, and one that I never suffer from, is to take your ego out of testing. So you should be asking yourself before you're doing something, why am I doing this? So is it to demonstrate impact for the client, which is great, or is it to satisfy my own ego? Perhaps not so good. Related to that is, where am I doing this testing? Like, can I do this offensive technique in the client's secondary or failover environment? And is that going to provide the same impact for them? If it is, just do it. It's the quickest way of eliminating some of that risk. And thirdly, if you need to dechain, just simply ask. So a lot of consultants consider this to be a slight on their technical ability if they need to dechain. But it's all about getting the most value for the client and reducing that risk. So if you need to dechain, it's absolutely fine to do so. The fourth is about picking your team carefully. So ideally, the people around you will understand their tools and understand the impact their tools are having on their targets. So this can be something like, what artifacts are your tools leaving behind after a successful exploit, for example? Ideally as well, they should also have an understanding of modern attacker techniques. So this is so they can accurately simulate the threats that the client is most likely to face. And also you should strive to, wherever possible, strike a balance between an understanding of the ICS-specific infrastructure and some of the more traditional, like softer consulting skills. So we mentioned these interviews and things. So having those core consulting skills are going to help you get that information from the client, build those relationships, and you're just going to make a more successful engagement. The fifth and final one is about identifying a security champion within the client's organization. Ideally, when we run these engagements, we're looking to interface with people like the CISO, CRO, etc. And this is really important because these are the people that have the authority and the autonomy to enable your testing, open the doors, give you access to the right people, give you the accounts you need, etc. And perhaps most importantly, it also allows you to take into account their fears. So you can ask them what they're most worried about at a board level. And then when you're giving your results, you can put those results into context for what they're actually worried about. And that's going to mean that your report gets visibility across the entire organization. So now that you've seen how I like to do these kind of engagements, I want to share with you some of the common attack paths that we found during these types of exercises. And I will say that they're not exhaustive. They're just kind of a glimpse at some of the common things that we find. So a couple of key points to note is we almost always start from the position of assumed compromise. So this is a phishing of someone in the corporate domain or a third-party supplier. And this is in line with what we've seen investigating real incidents for our CNI clients. And it should point out as well that we're always able to, so far, touch wood, able to escalate within the corporate environment. So I'm not going to touch on exactly how that's achieved during this talk, but we've had some really good Active Directory talks yesterday and today, and it's just leveraging those techniques that we're already very familiar with. So we've got our compromised third-party supplier or corporate employee down in the right-hand side. One of the first questions worth asking, just to play devil's advocate, is do you even need to get into the process control environment? So if your objective is simply to obtain OT-specific data, then we often find this kind of material just laying around in the corporate environment as well. So we found this type of thing in emails, file shares, information repositories, all the business planning applications so that you can just log in and see all the data you need. So it's worth asking yourself whether you actually need to do any further activity. Let's assume, for the sake of this talk then, that we do need to compromise the corporate environment, and we've done so. So we've got domain admin in the corporate domain. I mentioned earlier there's a few systems that legitimately need to talk to the process control environment. And one of those is Citrix. So we sometimes see Citrix being wrongly considered a security boundary. So we had one client that was using it in quite a unique double hop architecture. So corporate users were logging into the Citrix instance in corporate, and then they were using that to access the Citrix instance in process control. And from there, they were having their OT-specific applications served to them via XenApp. Well, on one of these engagements, what we were able to do was, as a normal user, break out of Citrix in the corporate, escalate privileges on there, dump the credentials, and at that point, we have legitimate users within the corporate domain. And there was something very simple, like password reuse, that enabled us to then access the Citrix instance in process control. And that's just one of the attack paths, but it highlights the speed at which someone can go from the corporate environment to accessing the OT-specific applications that are actually controlling these physical processes. We often find Citrix as well is easier to find and exploit than jump servers, although they do also offer similar attack paths. Following on some of the Active Directory talks that we've had today, we often find that a CNI client's AD architecture is suboptimal. So in fact, every single engagement I've been on for these, they are using the domain as the security boundary rather than the forest. So as an attacker, that's kind of got two key impacts for us. The first is that the compromise of any of the child domains automatically leads to the compromise of the entire forest. This is particularly pertinent for this example where the corporate and the process controls sit in the same forest. So if you compromise the corporate domain, you've compromised the process control domain as well. And the second is that there is often then, in this scenario, legitimate firewall rules between the domain controller and corporate and the domain controller and process control that we can use to pivot through and get onto the domain controller in that process control environment, despite there being perhaps tightly controlled firewall rules between the two. So great, let's say we're now on the domain controller within the process control environment. At this point, we're going to want to move closer towards the assets that are actually controlling those physical processes. So in this situation, like the control room would probably be a great place for me to start. And this would be really valuable for an attacker as well because they can just sit and passively watch what these operators are doing. And that's going to help them understand how to interface with these systems and what their potential attack paths could be from there. And we also find that the operators themselves have a false sense of security. So they may consider themselves isolated, or in some cases, they think they're air-gapped away from the rest of the network. And so they tend to have a lapse security posture. So we typically find the workstations they're using would be unpatched Windows 7 boxes. They often share Active Directory accounts. In one instance, they were writing them down next to their terminals, the username passwords. So it's these types of things that you would think they would have a higher security posture because of their role, but they have a false sense of security, and that can actually introduce security weaknesses that perhaps aren't there in the corporate environment. If you're on that DC, then you'll almost certainly be able to hit control room or the SCADA process servers. So a number of clients, they might block SMB and think that prevents you from moving laterally, et cetera. But almost always remote desktop will still be enabled. And we've also been able to use things like WinRM and DCOM for that lateral movement. So I'm willing to bet that you would find a path for lateral movement towards those assets. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of attack paths I haven't had a chance to explore, and this is a lightning talk, so I can't actually go into them in any level of detail now. But just by way of an example, some of the things we've been able to exploit in the past successfully, we find the OT-specific applications being served by Citrix haven't had much love from the security community, so they're often very easy to directly exploit those. I don't know what the root cause of that is. I don't know if that's because they're difficult to get access to these kind of applications in the right situation, or just no one's bothered. But I think that's certainly an area that we should be considering. We find as well lots of backups. So in one instance, we found a domain controller being backed up to a file share that any domain user could use and read. So it's things like this. It's worth spending the time looking through the exposure from these file shares. And also dormant support accounts. So in the scenario where the client has a non-security related emergency, they need to rapidly bring in their third-party suppliers to help debug, or perhaps the gas isn't working, they need to bring those in to help. And these just sit there with the same password, the password's never changed, and this can provide an easy avenue for exploitation. So to conclude then, I just want to reiterate the three main tenets of this talk. The first is that the attack positioning phase for a CNI client isn't as different as you perhaps may have thought. The second is that we need to do more threat-informed and intelligence-led testing for our CNI clients so that they can get a realistic sense of what their exposure to risk is. And then also how important, hopefully I've shared this with you now, how important collaboration is to reduce risk for both you and the client. So that's it. I can open it up for questions now. Thank you.